Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson, as well as Cassie the cat. Patty, how are you this evening?
I am okay. Busy, busy day, but um, you know, it's been fairly nice here. Almost 40 degrees today.
I don't understand. Well, yeah, you are further south than I am. I had to do some work outside today, and it was 32 Fahrenheit for those of you in the US who we use that antiquated Fahrenheit system. Yeah, the wind was blowing, and it was just absolutely miserable, and I couldn't wait to get that stuff done. And then I had a whole passel of indoor things to do. So it's been a busy day and I'm bushed.
Imagine going out in the cold always makes you tired.
Yeah, I just don't like it. Don't like it at all. Anyway, um, we do thank everyone for joining us for this episode, number 124, I believe. It'll be up there in the corner. Or, yeah,
Somewhere.
yeah, somewhere in the corner I put it. And if you would be so kind as to click the subscribe if you aren't already subscribed, click the like, the little bell that lets you get notified when we release new content, which we try to do every week. Sometimes life happens and we can't. Everything else is in the description. And with that being said, what's our topic for today?
Well, today I'm just going to tell some ghost stories, some interesting and unusual ones. I just feel like
Mhm.
going back home. To me, that's home.
I
So
have no complaints whatsoever for ghost stories. Nope.
I'm I looked at all kinds of things and I might come up with one of them for the next time, but today just felt like it's like putting on an old comfortable sweater. So, but I found some pretty interesting ones that I wanted to share. So, over the course of time, I've watched ghost stories and sometimes they morph a little bit, but the traditional components of a ghost story really never have changed. And I brought along, first of all, two examples of this. So there's a story that in 1915, Egyptologist Gaston Maspero published a translation of an ancient Egyptian ghost story. Now, they found these four broken pieces of pottery that
Okay.
basically told the vast majority of the story. So there are a few little odds and ends missing because there are pieces of the pottery missing.
Okay.
But to kind of give you the idea of what I'm talking about, this is what we know of this ghost story that dates back. Are y'all ready? To 1200 BC in Egypt. That's a while ago. So the story is supposedly took place in Luxor, which is ancient Thebes. And it, as I said, was discovered on poetry. The stories of a ghost of a mummified man who is telling the high priest of the god Amen about his current condition. And according to the pottery, this is what the spirit told this priest. I grew and did not see the rays of the sun. I did not breathe the air, but darkness was before me every day, and no one came to find me. The ghost seemed to complain that some accident had happened to him or to his tomb, but they could not decipher it. And he was complaining that this was what was holding him on the earth. And that's really the basic tenet of every ghost story I've ever, really 90% of them at least, is something happened that holds you here or brings you back to here. And it's not the only one. And for those who are familiar with ancient history, the Roman senator Pliny, um, who died in 113 AD, also told a ghost story which survives to this day. He wrote it in a bunch of his writings about this home in Athens that was a huge, beautiful home. It would have been something people would have sought to live in, but it got a very bad reputation because people said they would hear the clashing of irons, and I'm assuming they mean like chains,
Mhm.
and that they were frequently heard, and you would hear rattling of going through the house as if somebody were walking through dragging chains. Some people actually saw the form of an old man, emaciated and disheveled appearance. He had a long beard, his hair was all messed up, and he had chains on his hands and his feet. So eventually the house got such a bad reputation, no one would purchase it. And the owner of the home decided to rent it. They had to rent it cheaply because people knew the reputation of the house. A philosopher by the name of Athenodorus rented the house because it was cheap, and he knew the story of the ghost. And it didn't take long for him to Athenodorus to actually meet the ghost. He was in his home one night. He looked out and saw the man walking through his home, rattling these chains. And he followed this entity to wherever it sunk down into the floor. And so goes the story that the next morning he hired people to come and dig down below the floor and, break through the floor and go down into the ground. And according to Pliny, when this was done, the skeleton of a man in chains was found. The body had lain for a considerable period of time and had putrefied and molded. And after this body was given a proper burial, the ghost departed the house and it was haunted no more. This was translated, and you can find it in the a translation called Pliny the Younger, the Harvard Classics, published in 1914.
Kind of made me thought of Jacob Marley when you said rattling the chains and walking around. So
yeah, I mean, like I said, like, ghost stories don't really ever, the genesis for them doesn't ever really change. And we're going to work our way forward to just some plain old ghost stories. But I found another one I thought was really interesting. So King Louis the 11th, his half-sister's name was Charlotte de Valois. And she married, this would have been in 1477. And she married a man named Brissac. And she ended up going to his castle, which was this beautiful chateau. It is amazing. I can't even, it is indeed like a king's castle with huge columns, long hallways, 20-foot high ceilings. It's just the whole thing inlaid with marble, just beautiful. I went and looked at some of the photographs of this place. And and anyhow, his name was Jacques Brissac, and some people called him Jacques de Brise. There's two different names. I guess it's titles and things that are at play in all of this. So Charlotte didn't marry him for love. She married him for money. But that a lot of people have in the past and do today. But Charlotte fell in love with one of the huntsmen that her husband had assigned to kind of keep guard over her. And one night, one of the servants woke up Jacques and told him that his wife was in the apartment above the chapel with this huntsman and that they were having an affair. So Jacques got dressed and went up, caught them, and killed them. Now, how he killed them goes from extremely gory, like he hacked him apart with a sword, to he stabbed him in the passion of anger. Supposedly, his wife was known for wearing hunter green. That was her favorite color, so she had a lot of capes and dresses and what have you in that color. On the night he found her, she had been had a hunter green dress on. Wasn't on at that time, but and so when he went to her funeral, he did not dress in black as was customary. He wore a outfit that he had made that was completely hunter green. After that, the house was the chateau was said to be haunted until the end of its existence, and it was haunted by a woman in a green dress walking down the hall, often going furtively up the stairs past the chapel to the apartment above, which would be where her lover and her used to have assassinations, and so it's an interesting story and very much just, a really interesting one. Now, there's another one that I thought was really, really fascinating. This took place in 1868. There was a place called Woodchester Mansion that was supposed to be built in England. And the man who hired, who wanted to build this mansion, he he spent a fortune, absolutely a fortune to build this place. And it was um, piece after piece, these great big massive rooms, tons of money poured into it. It was years and years. It reminded me very much of the Winchester story, you know, where they were constantly adding on, except
Okay. Yeah. Mhm.
none of the rooms were ever completed. None. And finally, he had an argument with the first architect several years in, and the first architect stopped, and then he hired another architect, and he worked for several years. And then there is this mystery about this mansion because literally everybody just put their tools down one day and walked away. Like they left their tools there. They said the ladders were leaning against the wall, hammers dropped to the floor. Um, you know, the carpenter's toolboxes left there. Now I can understand if you weren't getting paid, you walk off the job, but you take your tools with you because you're
Oh yeah.
journeyman and you
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's their livelihood. Why would they leave them?
exactly.
Mhm.
So there's always been these whispers and stories that the place was very, very haunted. And later in life, this gentleman's son would come back and try to finish the mansion. He finished one room and then he gave it up because again something happened. And this is like there's stories of ghosts seen walking there, a phantom coffin going by, and none of it fits the history. They don't know why, but it seems insane that they didn't sell the property, that something else didn't occur. And it was believed that the family held on to the house. They lost it eventually, and it got badly damaged during World War II. And just it became used for storage, the basement and stuff for storage and what have you. It was just insane that the house would, be damaged and end up doing just sort of sitting there. Apparently, they put literally their entire fortune into this property between the two attempts to keep the house, to finish the house, and it's never been finished to this day. And they say that anybody that walks out through that area, they talk about feeling watched, hearing sounds, people following you when you turn back to look. There's nobody there. Just all kinds of weird stories. But I thought it was if anybody knows more about it, I would love to know. I know we have some listeners in England and what have you, and it would be really interesting to find out more about it. I just thought it was a fascinating story. And brings me to a story that I came across, and it's just a really interesting story to me. It's called Death in the Pot. And it's a story about these two young women who were riding along on horseback. They noticed these dogs fighting over a bone in the distance. And as they rode up to see what was, what all the hubbub was, a man came out of the woods. He was obviously a hiker, and they were his dogs. He calls his dogs, and the ladies, get down and they stop to talk to the hiker a minute. And as they do, they realize this isn't a deer bone, which was their first assumption. It was it was a human bone.
Mhm.
And it had been my first assumption to see something like that and think it was a deer bone, you know. But as they looked at it a little more closely, they realized it was a human bone. It was a human leg bone. And the man said, is there a cemetery near here? Is there somehow, someplace the dogs could have gotten this thing? And they said, no, but you're on the way to a place called Lucy Cobb's Inn. And it was not open anymore, but it was a local legend, like a local story. There was a woman by the name of Lucy Cobb, and in the mid 1800s, her family operated this little tiny um, inn, and it was between Sandy and Beaver Canals in Columbiana County, and it was, just a little tiny tucked away in the place. Now, Lucy wasn't a really beautiful woman. She was kind of large boned, husky, homely, older Dutch lady. She had a couple friends, and nobody really saw her much except if you were um, traveling through there and staying overnight, except for the fact that there were travelers and canal workers who would stop there because she cooked and you could buy a meal. And she was apparently a fine cook. She'd make pies, she'd make stews, and you could get a decent meal at a reasonable price. So everybody knew about this little place, and that's really basically what kept it going. And at one point in time, she fell in love with a gentleman by the name of Tommy Ware. He was a local man. He was a stone cutter, big, strong, brawny fella. And she used to take treats, little sweets and stuff like that. And he would stop by from time to time and get a meal. And so she would take these little treats and either give it to him there or drop them at his house. And he didn't know who it was because it would be done in the dead of night, you know, kind of a deal. And one day she decided to go over and drop him off a little cherry pie. And when she got there, she saw Tommy was not alone. He was with a woman from town named Sarah. And that's how she found out Tommy had a sweetheart. And that Tommy was planning to marry this young woman. Tommy had no idea what was going on, but in her head, he had betrayed her. So late that night, after her boarders had gone to sleep, Lucy snuck out, went back into the woods a ways, and dug two graves near her the back end of her garden wall. And she gathered up some mushrooms she knew to be poisonous, and she put them in her pocket. The next day, she made this stew, and she took it to Tommy and his girl because she had found out that not only was he engaged to this girl, but that they were to get married the night before. So this was their first day after their wedding. And to celebrate, she had brought them a pot of stew. Other folks had brought them things, you know, because you're newlyweds and all of that. It was something locally they did. Well, she, of course, had secreted the mushrooms in it, and it didn't take long before they ate the stew. It was really good. Everybody trusted it. And because she had made a lot of meals for everybody, that evening, Sarah fell sick, and then Tommy fell sick, and they ended up dying. And as soon as they had died, Lucy came in. She had been watching from outside all evening as they had been in their death throes. She knew it would take a couple hours for those mushrooms to kill them. He dragged them one by one through the woods out to the graves she had dug, and then she buried them. And nobody knew about it. For a while, people talked about Tommy and Sarah, maybe that they had run off because they wanted a different type of life or something had happened and all kinds of stuff. But nobody had ever had heard anything, so they didn't know what to make of it. But after that, people started to whisper because Lucy got really odd, very angry, and just off the plumb, if you will. And she talked to people that weren't there and stuff like that. She'd tell them to leave her alone. And, you know, people thought she'd gone insane. She might have gone insane from what she, gone through. I don't know. So they said, well, there's a story. We don't know if it's true or not, but the story's always been that this old lady Lucy had murdered this young man, Tommy, and his new wife, and buried her, but nobody ever really found them. Well, they kind of speculated on it a couple minutes, and the hiker said, well, we're just not taking this with us. And he took a stick and dug a little hole and plopped the leg or the bone in there and told the ladies to have a good day. And he's like, that's just a terrible, creepy story. Well, after this, Nanette and this woman and her friend, they went to town and they were talking, and the coroner went out and dug up the bone. And sure enough, it was a male's bone, somewhere between 18 and 20 years old, dating from about the 1830s. And based upon all that, they began to figure this out. And they found the bodies, the skeletal remains of Tommy and his wife. And they put them back in the spot they were in. But ever after, people have seen Tommy and his wife. And the crazier thing is right behind them is a dark shadow of a woman, kind of hunched over. Is it possible she's still stalking them, even from the grave? It's just a creepy little story. I couldn't help it. I read it and I thought, oh my. It reminds me very much. There's a story from up around um, Shellsburg in Bedford County, Pennsylvania,
Okay.
of it's called Lucretia. And the story was that and I wrote about it in one of my early books. You might recognize the story because I know you've read most of my books. That this woman, this was in the early 1900s, that her husband was a bit of a drunk, and Lucretia and he had some 2 or 3 children, and he'd come home from work and get a snootful on the way home, and then be just really vile to everybody, beating on the kids, and just a nasty human being. And so Lucretia would make it her life's work to put the kids to bed before he got home, and the kids knew not to get up no matter what they heard. It was not a very pleasant life. And it was just that old story that all the local kids told, this old abandoned house out in the middle of nowhere, that's Lucretia's house, blah 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 blah. But here's the story. Years and years ago, oh my gosh, probably 30 years ago or more now, I met a young woman. I would have been in my late 20s. She would have been about 22, 23, where I worked at. And she found out I liked ghost stories and had written a couple stories. At that time, I'd only written a few ghost stories. And one day at work, she sat down beside me at the table and she said, "Do you have a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "I know you like ghosts and stuff, and I have a story to tell you. And I don't think I haven't told it to more than 2 or 3 other people because I don't think people believe us. But this is true. And I just need to tell somebody." And I've heard that since then 1,000 times, where people just need to tell somebody. But anyway, this is what she told us. About a year earlier, her and her boyfriend and her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend were double dating. And they had parked out at Lucretia's because it was out of the way. And they'd kind of pulled up the driveway and around the house where nobody could see their vehicle. And it was a nice, it was kind of one of those late September, early October nice nights with a big shiny moon and no leaves on the trees and that kind of a thing. And she's like, honestly, we were necking. That's just all you need to know. We were necking. And all of a sudden, from this house, this old abandoned house, was this scream. And then she's like, and we heard kids. And of course, that startled them, like somebody's here. So the 2 young men get out of the car and they're watching, and the girls are sitting in the car and they're watching. And like I said, they're parked in the driveway, so they're kind of looking at the front door. And all of a sudden, the front door came open. You could hear kids screaming, "No, no," and crying inside the house. You saw this man drag this woman, she's kind of tall and thin with red hair, and he drug her across the yard, and he's just thumping on her. And one of the guys said, "We got to stop them," thinking he was going to try to stop the guy from hitting her anymore. And the other guy said, "I don't think she's alive." And he's like, "What do you mean? She's moving." And he's like, I just know I'm not going. So they stood there a couple seconds, and supposedly what this woman said is the guy drug her across the yard and he hung her. He throttled her, knocked her unconscious, or broke her neck, but then he went and got a rope and he hung her. And then he walked back in the house and you could hear shotgun blasts. Now, the story was that on one night, Lucretia's husband came home and he was angry because she kept putting the kids to bed early, and he got in a bad fight with her. And the next day they found her hanging from the tree in the front yard. The kids were shot and he was never found. And she said, "We always thought it was just a wives' tale, like an urban legend or something." But she's like, I got to tell you, I think it really happened. I honestly do. Now, the interesting thing is right after she told me this, I stopped out to talk to the people that owned it. Like they lived in the next property over and they had bought the piece of ground.
Okay.
And I had looked it up and wanted to talk to them. And the guy said to me, I don't want to talk about her. As soon as I got out of the car, I said hi, who I am and all this. And like it's time I was writing for the Shopper's Guide, so people knew my name because I
Mhm.
wrote history and folklore and stuff like that and recipes and stuff. So I was always, people knew. And so I introduced myself and he just looked at me and he goes, I don't want to talk about her. And I'm like, who? And he's like, Lucretia. I don't want to talk about her. And I'm like, how do you know I'm here for her? And he's like, look, I've read your columns. That's got to be the reason you're here. And I said, well, actually it is. And he's like, don't worry about it. I'm taking care of it. Well, what he ended up doing, I found out a month or two later, was he had the fire department come and burn the house down. He cut all the trees down and then he had a priest come and pray over the grounds and then he sold it. So there's nothing left of Lucretia's now.
Well, you and I both know that just removing the house, removing the trees isn't going to stop it. Yeah. No, maybe the
Yeah,
priest doing it would, but yeah.
yeah. I honestly don't know. I've never heard another story. Like I was hearing a lot of stories of Lucretia for a while. Like 'cause I started asking around and people started coming forward and saying, "Oh yeah, when I was a teenager, we went out there. That was kind of a local hangout spot." And then after that, I've not heard another word. And they actually, um, there's nobody living on the property at this point. The last I was up there, there was nobody anyhow, and that would have been about a year ago.
Mhm.
So I don't know, but this story somehow just kind of reminded me of Lucretia and that, was she unfortunately was living through, if the story's true, the last events of her life and her children's lives. And what an awful story. So, it was just a really tragic tale. So, but it is what it is. So I wanted to tell this story. I thought this story was really interesting. There is a museum in Philadelphia that people might know about. It is the Rosicrucian Museum, I think is how you pronounce it. And it's basically it's dedicated to like the dead. I don't know how else to explain it. The dead. So they have bodies that have been preserved where half the body's pulled open, and literally they've pulled open the person's chest and all the muscles and everything's, it's all been petrified. They have mummies, they even have animal mummies, and just it's a very gruesome museum. And it's obviously a place like that would give you kind of creeps. So this story actually came to me from a woman who had gone there. She had was traveling and was staying in Philadelphia, heard about the museum, thought it sounded interesting, had heard they had mummies, and she was fascinated with mummies. So she decided while she was visiting the city, she would go and take a look at this museum. And she did. She and the people she was visiting and staying with. And she came to this room. There was this one room where there were several mummies, each of them in sealed glass cases, so you couldn't touch them. And in some places, there were these little mummified cats also in little glass boxes, so you wouldn't mess with them. And as she's standing there by herself, her friends had kind of moved on to another room, and she's standing there by herself looking at these mummies, and she hears this low cry of pain, like, oh, and she kind of whirls around thinking somebody like bumped into something or fell, or maybe they're having a heart attack, and there's nobody there. And the hackles kind of go up and she's like, okay, this is just creepy. I'm leaving. So she goes, finds her friends and goes home. But something about the mummy room just was creepy. So she goes back a couple days later before she has to leave. Something about it's just been really bugging her. You know how sometimes you just can't let something go.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We all have those moments where we just
Mhm.
can't let something go. And so she decided before she left to go back at one more time. So she goes back to the mummy room and she's standing there and she sees that this one mummy is a priest, and she's like, I wonder why that matters. And as she turns to leave, she hears, oh, like again, pain. She whirls around, and she knows now it's coming from this mummified priest. And there's nobody else in the area. In fact, there's nobody else in the entire section of the floor. She leaves. And she doesn't really know what do you do with it. So several months go by. She has to go back into the Philadelphia area for some business. She ends up going back to the museum. And this time, almost all the mummies are gone. Just the priest is still there. And some of the cats. And as she walks into the room, she's walking around. She walks right up to the case where the priest is at. And she had taken the time to learn enough ancient Egyptian, like you can do those things where you can look up a couple words, and she had learned the phrase Etham Hopip. I can't say it, Hopip. And it means hello. It's a greeting. And she looked and she realized she was all alone. And then she saw a door on the case, like it was superimposed over the case. And suddenly she got the idea that this guy was showing her what he wanted. And she said, so I closed my eyes and I began to imagine that door opening. And I said, I think you want to leave. Just go. And she said, I felt a slight rush of wind as if the door had swung open right in front of me. And I opened my eyes and he was still there. He was still in the case, and that door was no longer visible. But she said, I walked away and I felt something following me. And I got the distinct impression that he wasn't going to leave his body for long, but he wanted me to know that he thanked me because I had opened that spiritual door so he could come and go and he wasn't stuck in the glass case anymore. And she's like, I don't care if you believe it or you don't believe it, but it's what happened.
That's pretty bizarre.
Well,
Macabre, but bizarre. Yeah, yeah.
It's a very interesting way to free somebody, isn't it?
Never heard anything like that before. Now,
I mean, I've heard, like in the new agey stuff, they'll talk about imagine something in like a pink bubble of light, or, you know, imagine that you're flying out of your body, or imagine that this is happening or that. Like, if you think it becomes so, kind of a deal in the spirit world. But this was interesting because she just kind of went on her instincts, and that's what her instincts told her. And she was convinced that that's why he was moaning, is because he couldn't get out and he wanted to be able to walk. So the interesting thing would be to find out if that room became haunted after she left, in the traditional sense of people saw this priest walking around the halls or something. So I just thought it was a really interesting story. So this next story, again, was one that I heard. There was this gentleman told me the story about, he used to live in an area out in the woods where like several hiking trails went through, like at the edge of his property. And there would be lots of people with dogs and lots of joggers and hikers every weekend. Kind of reminded me of Rails to Trails, the way he described it, you know, where there's like these places you just every weekend everybody goes and hangs out and walks. And he said he was, you know, he'd lived there for a couple years. He had always thought it was a kind of creepy place, but it was a beautiful house in the middle of the woods, which he really liked, and it was cheap. So for a young guy, that's a pretty good deal. And he said, one night I was in my house, I was laying down, and I had this really strange dream about an old lady, and she came up the stairs and into my room in the dream, and she kept telling me, you need to go outside. You need to go outside. Something about it freaked him out so bad that he startled and he came awake. So he got up, he got a glass of water, went to the bathroom, that kind of thing, and laid back down. And he said, as soon as I fell asleep, I had the same dream, this old lady, and she said again, you have to go outside. And I kept telling her, it's cold, I don't want to go outside. And I woke up and I in the dream, and he got up in reality and got another drink of water and sort of sat there for a while. Eventually he fell asleep in a chair, and the third time she came to him that night. And he said again, I don't want to go outside. It's cold. And he woke up, and she never in his waking state did he see her, but all for 3 times in this night in the dream. And he said the next day he was walking. It was cold and kind of chilly and what have you. And he was walking along the edge of his property. He saw some people that were hikers. They were waving, and they stopped asking some questions about how far down the trail goes, and if where's there restrooms at, and that kind of stuff that touristy people ask. And he answered them, and he said the one jogger said something about, "Did you notice that old lady like down there?" And he turned around and he looked, and he saw this old lady like at the far end of his property, and she was just standing there, and she motioned him to come. And he said, "I was scared to death, but at the same time I felt like I was compelled to come." And I said to the jogger, "No, I hadn't seen her till you pointed her out to me." And he said, "Well, she's awful far out, don't you think, for somebody so old?" And he's like, I'm estimating maybe 80 years old, and she'd had to have walked at least 2 miles to get to where I lived on
Oh,
the
okay.
trails.
Hmm.
So that's a long ways for an old lady to walk. And he said, I walked, I excused myself eventually and walked down that way. And as she saw me coming, she smiled, and she just turned around and started walking back the way she would have had to have come down that 2 mile stretch. And about a quarter of the way along, she turns, and it looks like a deer trail back into the woods. Anybody that's ever walked in the woods, you can tell the deer paths because they're
Hmm.
worn. It was that kind of a deal. And she went down that way, and he followed her. He said, she looked physically real, but I knew she couldn't be. And I followed her, stayed far back from her, but just kept her in sight. And he said, then she pointed to this one spot and was just gone. So he kind of walked around the spot a little bit, and he realized that underneath all the brush and the debris, there was the foundation of a house. Somebody had once lived here. And she didn't point at the house, but it was right by the house, the spot. So it was pretty easy to see the whole concept. Eventually, he turned around and went back and found out that this house had been lived in about 40 years ago by this elderly lady, and she had just disappeared. And so he went back a few days later, and he just sort of stood there, and he said, "I don't know what you wanted from me, but I don't know how I can help you." That night he had a dream in which she showed him that she was walking from her house. He knew it was her house. He said, "I don't know how I knew. I just knew this had to be what her house had looked like." And she was walking down a trail in the woods, and she stopped at this area where there was like a little bit of a cave. And she sat there and sort of took shelter there. And then she just he said it looked like a heart attack. So the next day he walks down that path, kind of convincing himself. He gets a buddy and they walk down. And sure enough, there's this little cave, kind of shallow cave. And he said, I told my friend, I don't want to be the first one to go in. So his friend walked in, and there was a bundle of bones and rags. And he said, we didn't see anything else. I didn't want to see anything else. But I did go back to the house and call the police. And she apparently wanted proper burial to be found. And why she waited 40 years and for him, he's not sure.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Maybe he was somebody easy enough to contact. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hmm.
Because, not everybody is. But he helped her to get her burial. And, you know, and I just couldn't, again, I was just like, I think this week's been a little introspection for me. And it reminded me very much of this lady that my dad used to help. There was this old woman. She always wore men's clothes and a big old men's fur, like furry coat, like heavy coat. And she wore men's boots. And she'd always pulled her hair, it was long white gray hair, and she'd pull it back in a ponytail. And she wore a men's ski cap. And we'd always see her walking. And she'd be walking towards our little town where I grew up. And my dad would pick her up, and then he'd take her to town. And lots of times he would take her home again. And I would be in the truck with them, and or the car, whatever he was driving. We had both. And he always talked to her. He seemed to know her. I don't know from where. And I asked him about her a couple times. And many years went by, and my dad died when I was 12, and I kind of lost touch with all that stuff because we had a lot bigger fish to fry, frankly, trying to build a new life and live somewhere else in the region and all of that. But as an adult, I went back down that little dirt road where she lived to see the ruins of her house. And I don't know why she stuck in my head my whole life. Like, it's very casual connection. I remember them talking 4 or 5 times in the car. I remember asking a couple questions, but it wasn't enough to like make her this figure burned into my memory. But it's for some reason I never forgot her. And I was talking to a guy that lived next to where her house was. And when I say next to, I don't mean like actually next to. In the
Country
woods,
next to. Yeah.
country next to. It's like a half a mile away. I pulled into this dude's driveway on the way out and said, when did the old house fall in? And he's like, oh my, oh gosh, about 15 years ago now. And then I said, what happened to the old lady? And he's like, oh, well, her husband died, and he told me that she lived there by herself for a while. And he said, but you should probably stay away from that house. And I said, why? And he said, they say that place is haunted. And I'm like, no, I didn't know that. But maybe that's, I don't know. And he said, yeah. Nobody would live there after she died. There's 3 or 4 folks that tried, but nobody lived there for very long. They'd see her coming out of the house around to the back. She used to go out the back door and get wood for the cook stove in her kitchen. And, still dressed in those men's clothes and what have you, she wore her whole life. But she'd be seen in the house or going out the back door to fetch the wood where the wood pile used to be and stuff like that. And it was enough to unnerve people. And you know what? I can't tell you I saw her. I can't tell you any of that. But I don't know. I often wondered if maybe in some way I kind of got an idea that she was going to be important or she needed to have her story told. And that's why she stuck in my head. Like I said, I would have been no older than maybe, I don't know, 8, 10, maybe years old. But that story kind of reminded me of that old lady.
I know if somebody tells me, oh, I wouldn't go there, that place is haunted, I'm like, ding, let's go have a look.
Now, see, like when I was a kid, well, I ghost hunt. So like I've gone out there a half dozen or so times. I haven't been out there for maybe a year or 2. But for some reason, I don't ghost hunt that spot. I just go out and talk to her, if that makes sense.
It does, sure.
Like I go out and I say, if you're still here, I want you to know you don't have to stay here unless you want to. If you need help or anything like that, I'm more than happy to help you. And then I'll tell her my dad's name and say, I'm his daughter, and I remember you when you were alive. Things like that. Like I don't know why, but I've always been drawn back to that place. I've taken my kids out 3 or 4 times, as they got older. And I don't know the connection. My dad never really talked much about her, just that he knew her, that she was just a sorry, sort of a sad old lady, and he felt bad for her. And it was like 3 or 4 miles from her house to town, and people would pick her up. Mostly, I know my dad did multiple times and help her along a little bit. But I don't know if she's still there or not, but if she is, the offer still applies. So, I just found it interesting. And, the stories I grew up on, or I've been finding so many parallels with them and other ghost stories. I find ghost stories fascinating, even though they're all the same story over and over again, like a half dozen different plot lines. They're still so intense, if you will. And, so I'm going to invite everybody tonight, do something I don't often do. If you have a ghost story or a story that stuck with you your whole life, something you've never been able to emotionally or mentally shake, I would be very honored if you would share it with us. You can change names, tell me you don't want your identity told, but I know I'm not the only person. I'm not even going to say I can't imagine I am. I know I'm not the only person who's had those moments. And I've shared a couple of them with you here tonight. Others I've shared over the course of time. And if you would take a little time to drop us a story and tell us, I'd appreciate it. And if any of you have any stories of angels or miracles, I would also appreciate hearing them. Still working on gathering data for the upcoming book. Again, your identity will be completely shielded. And we'll be visiting some of those stories in the upcoming months, some of the ones I found particularly interesting. So I'm going to wish everybody a wonderful evening and say good night.